earlier years, the more difficult to the latter. Unquote. The subject-centered way of designing a school curriculum has been under fire for a century and more. In British secondary education, many post-war pioneers of comprehensive education, building on earlier attempts to emancipate primary schools from the elementary tradition, played their part in this by their adoption of project work and interdisciplinary studies and by their interest in the curricular impact of whole school process. With the dissipation since the 1980s of the post-war political dream of continuing social improvement in an egalitarian direction, curricular reform has been a major victim. The traditional subject-based curriculum that Norwood castigated was imposed by law on all state schools in 1988, and the present coalition government is further tightening its stranglehold. We are talking about a curriculum of discrete academic subjects. Its central ones, English to some extent apart, are different branches of knowledge: mathematics, science, history, geography, and a foreign language. Artistic subjects like music and visual art and design are peripheral, as is physical education. It is not only in Britain that this traditional curriculum holds away. Across the globe, it is often taken for granted, its credentials unquestioned. But if we look at these credentials, they prove full of holes. Take the justification given by the current British Secretary of State for Education, Michael Gove. He argues that a broad, subject-based curriculum gives students a basis for choice. It equips them to become autonomous individuals, or, as he likes to put it, authors of their own life story. Unquote. But this is problematic as a rationale. It acknowledges that where one starts is not with subjects themselves, but with wider aims. And once one does this in this particular case, further questions arise like, 1. What else do pupils need as equipment for autonomy besides what they gain from school subjects? What about personal qualities like self-confidence, courage, practical judgment, and so on? 2. Insofar as they need various forms of understanding, could this not come in other ways than through a subject-based framework, for example, through projects and interdisciplinary themes of various sorts? 3. Given that in a democracy autonomy does indeed seem a worthy aim, is it the only aim? What about concern for one's fellow citizens, for instance? Other justifications for the standard curriculum are also heard these days. One, by my Institute of Education colleague Michael Young, is that it is a good vehicle for passing on what he calls powerful knowledge. I have critiqued this elsewhere and will not go through my counter-argument here, save to say that it shows that Young's position is circular, since the definition of powerful knowledge, for which he is indebted to Vygotsky, comes down to knowledge gained from standard school subjects. But it is not just in the 20th century that the traditional curriculum has faced problems over justification. In the late 20th century, Richard Peters' claim that it initiated learners into intrinsically valuable activities quickly came under fire, as did his colleague Paul Hirsch's defense, if not of the standard curriculum as such, at least of the forms of knowledge that he saw as constituting a liberal education. Earlier in the 20th century, it was psychology rather than philosophy that seemed to some to offer a rationale, in the shape of Cyril Bird's celebrated view that an academic curriculum suited the kinds of minds of pupils with a high IQ, while those with low ones were incapable of transcending innately given intellectual ceilings. In the 19th century, faculty of psychology rather than individual psychology produced what are now seen as patently inadequate arguments, that the memory, for instance, is best trained via languages and history and the power of observation via science. I go into these historical matters in my recent book, The Invention of Secondary Curriculum. Having failed to find adequate reasons for the standard curriculum, I turned in this book from philosophy to history, seeking explanation of what seemed to be lacking in justification. It seems that one of the sturdiest roots of the traditional subject-based curriculum is to be found as early as the mid-16th century in the pedagogical revolution initiated by the French philosophy professor and pedagogue Petrus Ramus, and pursued in the 17th century by Ramus' encyclopedic descendants such as Keckerman, Alsted, and Comenius. The basic idea was to provide a more efficient, better organized, and more practically useful form of education than that offered by the prevailing university regime, with its focus on classical texts and commentaries in which students could all too easily lose their way among all the obscurities. Ramus and his successors built new school and college curricula around separate academic subjects. Knowledge was parceled up for pedagogical reasons into discrete, logically arranged areas, each of which was internally organized according to a similar logic, moving from the most general and abstract categories to one more specific and particular. Ramus and his followers used the resources of the young age of print to generate tree diagrams showing this progression of the leading ideas in a discipline, and short textbooks that gave the learner the bones of a subject area before proceeding into further depth. The new kind of education especially appealed to the Calvinists, with their emphasis on an ordered system of beliefs, paring away excrescences, simplicity and directness, efficiency and time-saving, diligence and useful application of knowledge. The new learning was taken up by the Puritans in England and at Harvard College in New England and by Presbyterians in Scotland. These and other radical Protestant communities developed it through the 17th and 18th centuries and into the 19th. The new education was centered on knowledge alone. The latter was at the heart of early Protestant thinking about education, with its insistence, in opposition to the Catholic doctrine, that believers should have access unmediated by ecclesiastical authority to an understanding of the wonders of God's creation. Other aspects of our mental life, the imagination, for instance, and the emotions, were pedagogically suspect as they tempted us to deviate from the path of truth. Today, we still live in the shadow of this way of thinking, as is seen in the lower place that our curriculum accords to the arts as distinct from kinds of knowledge. There is an interesting cameo of how this new curriculum was introduced into India. The influential Scottish Presbyterian missionary Alexander Duff, 1806 to 78, opened a secondary school in Calcutta in 1830. He describes how, when he was teaching a scientific explanation of rain, a student asked in some perturbation, "If your account be the true one, what becomes of our Shastra?" A Hindu text that said rain came from the trunk of the elephant of the god Indra. The incident had a revelatory effect on Duff. He wrote, quote, "It now seemed as if geography, general history, and natural philosophy, from their direct effect in destroying Hinduism, had been divested of their secularity and stamped with an impress of sacredness. In this view of the case, the teaching of these branches seemed no longer an indirect, secondary, ambiguous part of missionary labor, but, in a sense, as direct, primary and indubitable as the teaching of religion itself." In a wider time frame, the introduction of the modern curriculum into India did indeed weaken the hold of Hindu explanations of what the world is like, but without leading many students to take the further step of embracing the Christian perspective. Alexander Duff was correct in associating modern curriculum subjects with sacredness. A large part of their appeal, taken as a whole to radical Protestants, had been for a century or two that they together provided a comprehensive panorama of the glories of God's created universe. Hence, the importance of an encyclopedic education in this way of thinking. This religious rationale gives us yet another kind of justification for the traditional curriculum. In some ways, it makes more sense than the later ones described above, assuming, and for many, including myself, this is an unacceptable assumption that God in fact exists. I have said a lot so far about the shortcomings of the traditional subject-based curriculum. More on this, as I say, can be found in the work that I just just published, Invention of Secondary Curriculum. But it is time now to turn from critique to a positive alternative. This is an aims-based rather than a subject-based curriculum. Curriculum statements in every country are usually prefaced by a statement of aims. Too often, this remains something like a high-sounding mission statement that teachers and others who use the curriculum statement quickly skim over and forget in their desire to find what detailed syllabi are required in geography or some other subject. In the new book that my Institute of Education colleague Michael Reis and I are publishing, called An Aims-Based Curriculum, we argue for aims that are no longer curtain raisers to a predetermined curriculum, but aims that go all the way down. Our vision is of schools whose every activity is a reflection of its fundamental aims and justifiable by reference to them. It is a vision that does not protect a special place for traditional subjects or for anything else. It starts from very general aims on which there is likely to be wide consensus in a liberal democratic society and derives more specific aims from these. This is what the first lengthier part of our book provides. The second part looks at how this scheme can be practically realized, at issues relating to political control, the division of curricular responsibility between state and school, and implications for assessment, inspection, and teacher education. Here, I focus on the first part, the aims-based approach itself. The model we adopt is a kind of unfolding. We begin with very general aims, then show how these generate more specific aims and how from these in turn even more specific ones can be derived. We show that in this way one can derive aims just as detailed as those found in conventional curriculum planning, including many that overlap with these. As an example, if we take it that if a major aim is to equip students to become responsible citizens, they will have, among others, to know something about the society they live in. One aspect of this is having some understanding of its economy. This in turn requires some grasp of relevant aspects of the science, technology, and mathematics underlying this economy. At the level of detail, there will be much overlap here with current requirements in these fields. The difference is that those teaching the specifics will be constantly referring back to the wider and wider frameworks within which these particulars are set: the economy, our society, citizenship, our personal and collective well-being. They will be less guided by the specialist requirements of a school subject. We see our task in the book as mapping out the larger aims and relationships between them. At the most general level, this takes us into the realm of ethics and political philosophy. In this book, we can do no more than touch on this, and so have to refer readers at many points to further discussions in the philosophical literature. I'll now briefly outline the major aims from which we start. We begin from the suggestion that school education should equip every child, 1, to lead a life that is personally flourishing, and 2, to help others to do so too. Then we show in more detail what each of these involves. There is now a large philosophical literature on what it is to lead a flourishing life. We draw on this to suggest that this life has much to do with being enjoyably, wholeheartedly, and successfully immersed in worthwhile relationships and activities. Some people, not least in education, confine intrinsically worthwhile pursuits to intellectual and aesthetic ones, but the present account is much broader. It includes such things as intimate relationships, meaningful work, making music, scholarly research, gardening, eating good food, watching an excellent film. Nearly all of us in a modern society like our own assume it is ideally up to us largely to choose the mix of relationships and activities that best suit us. Unlike many of our ancestors, nearly all of us are deeply attached to personal autonomy as a value. A central aim of the school should be to prepare students for a life of autonomous, wholehearted, and successful engagement in worthwhile relationships, activities, and experiences. In order to lead a flourishing life, Certain basic needs must be met. We all need air, water, food, shelter, a certain level of health, a certain level of income. Psychologically, we need companionship, respect, recognition, security and freedom from attack, arbitrary arrest and other impositions. Schools cannot provide all these things, but to some, like health and money management and recognition, they can make various kinds of contribution. Working with parents too, they can also help to develop the personal qualities that help us to live a fulfilling life. Things like proper regulation of our emotions and our bodily desires for such things as food, drink, sex, novelty. A measure of confidence and self-esteem, independence of thought and moral courage. The second altruistic aim about helping others to lead a flourishing life has three dimensions. First, a moral one. We help others to flourish by possessing certain other directed personal qualities: cooperativeness, kindness, tolerance, fairness, treating people with respect, helping them to meet their needs, and so on. Secondly, within this broad moral aim, we can place more specifically civic aims. We want children to become good citizens, concerned for the public interest as well as more private concerns, willing to collaborate with others in civic matters, disposed not to take at their face value the pronouncements of politicians and the pressure groups behind them, but subject them to critical scrutiny, standing up against corruption in public life, and so on. And thirdly, within this civic aim is a more specific aim of equipping young people to contribute to the common good through the work they do, both paid and unpaid. This is where education for employment comes into the picture. None of these aims and sub-aims is discrete from others. Importantly, those to do with pupils' own good are not discrete from the altruistic ones. Think of intimate friendships, of taking up teaching or nursing as a career, of other collaborative pursuits of all sorts. What is good for one person can be good for others too. The two major aims mentioned would not make sense without bringing in a third aim that they presuppose. We call this the area of background understanding, the understanding in broad strokes of human nature, of our social life and how it has developed as it is, and of the natural world in which we live. You may ask, what is the justification for these particular aims? Don't they simply reflect my own personal preferences? I hope they go deeper than that. Their justification goes back to the basic values of a liberal democracy. If you take as given that you want an education system in line with those values, these are the kind of aims you will favor. We explore these three major aims in more detail later in the book, deriving more determinate aims as we go. I gave an example just now that proceeds from altruistic aims to education for citizenship, to understanding society, to understanding the economy, to understanding the STEM areas that underpin this. This is, of course, only one route into more detailed aims. There are other further branchings at every point, here as elsewhere. Education for citizenship, for instance, is a matter of encouraging certain democratic dispositions as well as about various sorts of understanding. As the example of science and math shows, an aims-based curriculum can generate much of the familiar content found in curriculum that starts from discrete subjects. Abandoning a traditional subject-based curriculum does not mean demoting scientific, mathematical, historical, geographical, linguistic knowledge in education. What it means is that knowledge selected is more obviously relevant to wider purposes. Take quadratic equations in algebra. In a subject-based approach, for a proper induction into mathematics as a specialism, you have to master them. No question. In an aims-based approach, we begin more agnostically. We have yet to see whether the aims point us in their direction. In my civic example just given, where the ordinary citizen needs some understanding of the economy and its scientific mathematical underpinning, how essential is it for him or her to grasp quadratic equations? How would they rate against, say, elementary statistics? Although an aims-based approach will put due weight on mathematical, scientific, historical, and geographical knowledge, it does not follow that this will be acquired within the discrete school subjects of these names. This is a matter of what vehicles are selected in which to deliver these aims, not a matter of the aims themselves. While it will be a matter for the political realm to lay down a broad framework of aims in some detail, it will be the school's job to decide how best these aims can be pursued, whether by subjects as discrete entities, by projects, themes, interdisciplinary activities, whole-scale processes, or whatever. An aims-based approach does not put all the weight on knowledge acquisition. Far from it. Aims to do with possessing knowledge are always subordinate to wider aims about the kind of person one is, about the personal qualities one needs to lead a fulfilling life, act morally, be a good citizen and worker. Students can have as much knowledge as you like about what the world is like, about human history or about higher mathematics. But if they finish their education hopelessly inhibited about personal relationships, totally lacking in confidence, or even worse, in a concern for other people, what avails them their academic learning? The aims-based approach is a huge improvement on a subject-based one. If we were not so attached to subjects as our one type of building block, or to the legacy of encyclopedism that school education must be as comprehensive as possible, we could get so much further. Religious origins of the curriculum aside, there is an obvious reason why, until very recently, people felt that school education, topped for a few by university, should be packed tight with what was held to be essential intellectual provisioning for life's journey. For most, that journey was likely to be short. If they did not get when young everything they might need for life, when would they get it? Today, with centenarians becoming two a penny, we have space to loosen up. We can shift the priority from a comprehensive grounding by 16 or 18 to something better fitting our age. Children will still need a good foundation, of course, but there is no need for this to try to cover all bases. More important is that the grounding spring from appropriate aims rather than paying homage to tradition. Salient among these aims is that students enjoy learning and remain eager to continue learning once they have left school and throughout their lives. This is not a priority in a culture like our own in Britain and perhaps in India too, that leaves too many young people either switched off or glad to have exam cramming behind them. We need badly to rethink things from fundamentals.
Thank you very much. Hurrying you along, but we're actually going to finish on time, which is a good achievement. I would like, on your behalf, to thank all our three presenters, including the absent John, for getting yourself, I think, to a very good start. I'm not entirely sure that John's paper might not be guilty of something we're all prone to being guilty of, namely presenting us with a rather false antithesis. I'm not sure we have to, as it were, choose between a subject approach or an aims approach. I would think they could be interrelated. But having said that,